Happy Wednesday to everybody who's able to tune in. For those of you I haven't had the privilege of meeting yet, I'm Clarissa Constantine and I'm the founder of the Parent Tween Connection. And I am super excited for today's conversation because April is Autism Awareness Month. And so we're kicking off our conversations surrounding autism with Melissa Berger, who is the founder of Thriving with Autism. Hi, Melissa. I'm so excited to have you.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. This is great. Very exciting.
Absolutely. And as soon as I met you, I was like, hey, I know that you're somebody that we want to have on our podcast, which obviously goes to all of the places. We're live in our Facebook group, LinkedIn page, and YouTube. So if anyone who's tuning in through our Facebook group or on LinkedIn, go ahead and comment, ask questions. I can see them, and then I will field them to Melissa when we have the opportunity. But we are talking during our two sub or like mini conversations today. We're starting out talking about some of the challenges that families face when their kiddos are initially diagnosed with autism, especially when they're diagnosed a little bit older. And then our exclusive conversation for folks who are members of Parent Tween Village, we're actually going to get into talking about meltdowns, which Melissa makes a very clear distinction that there is a meltdown and it is not a tantrum. So even if you don't think that you know anyone in your world who navigates autism, tune in, learn, listen, because you never know. And I'm sure that some of what you're going to share, Melissa, applies broadly, even beyond the spectrum of navigating autism. So let's start with your story. And I know your story is very closely entwined with your daughter's. So let's start there.
Yes. Yes. In fact, I actually say that my story doesn't exist without her story.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter was diagnosed late. She was in her teen years when we discovered that she had an autism diagnosis. We were navigating COVID like everybody was, working on upended schedules, things being completely different and completely out of the normal routine. And her anxiety just started to just rocket.
Mm-hmm.
And she was in therapy, and I thought that we were doing all the right things. And lo and behold, I got a call one day from the therapist, and she said, I'm not sure what this is, but it's not in my wheelhouse. And I'm going to refer you to an outpatient program at a local hospital. And I heard that, and my stomach just kind of went, woof, and I was just like, oh no, okay, what's going on? So we got her into the program, did a lot of negotiating, a lot of persistent persuasion, I like to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And she started in the program. And within the first 3 days, they said, we think that there might be a diagnosis of autism on the table. Her
Wow.
reaction was, yay. My reaction was, ugh. Mostly because I felt this tremendous guilt and shame that I had missed it and that I didn't know what was going on.
Interesting.
And so from there, it began our process of trying to figure out how to get her all the support and access she needed.
So can I ask for a second? Do you know, like, or has she ever explained, or do you have a hypothesis as to why her reaction was, yay? Why was she like maybe excited about it? That's not
Have you
necessarily a
heard?
reaction that we would anticipate.
Right, except that imagine spending your entire childhood and school career knowing that something was different and that something about you didn't click and didn't mesh and didn't work the way that things did for other kids. Also, add in Instagram and all the creators and content creators that are out there and all the
Mhm.
information that is there. I swear, Instagram is kind of like Encyclopedia Britannica. I mean, it's just like there is so much there. And she all of a sudden, had a name for this feeling that she had been living with. And she had had the experience of reading and reading and reading and experiencing things on the Instagram accounts for people. And so all the pieces fell in place. And for
Sure.
her to have a name, it was relief.
Got it. To know that she wasn't broken, perhaps? Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you for clarifying. So then you said you had obviously some swamped emotions. You said like guilt for somehow not knowing something that you had this concept that you should have known.
Well, I mean, every parent likes to think that they know their kid and that they know what's going on with their kid
Sure.
and that they are in tune and they have answers and they have all the things. And, my daughter's an only child. I'm an only child. So my resource bank for who to compare her to and who to extrapolate, is this normal? Is this not normal? I hate that word, by the way, but is this a usual behavior or an unusual behavior? And I didn't have any of that. And so I had moments along the way for sure where I was like, hmm, that doesn't really line up, or that doesn't really make sense. I had
Mhm.
conversations with her teachers where I pushed about, what's going on in school, what's happening. But no one really said, yeah, maybe there is something happening. So my guilt was about not realizing it. I had fear because I didn't know what it meant for the future. I had apprehension about my ability to find her the resources that she deserved and that she needed for access. All of a sudden it's like, whoa, there's a lot going on here.
Right. Well, and I know the next conversation, or the next piece of the conversation we're going to be talking about, is how to find those resources. One of the things that I want to mention, though, for folks tuning in or listening on the podcast, is I liked your comment about the being tenacious, or being basically just never stopping, right? I do want to put a point out, though, that especially if your kids are in a public school system, there are legal ramifications for teachers who postulate. And so my understanding is that sometimes they won't postulate out of an appreciation for legal ramifications. So I just want to make a plug as we get into that later conversation for finding these outside resources, because there are, legal aspects of things where we, as the quote unquote consumer, or the parents of the kids being educated, in that we are the consumers of the service of education, have expectations that the school district sometimes can't meet, even though we think that they could, should, would, whatever. And so that's a different conversation. I just want to put a point in there for folks listening. So um can you share a little bit more for other parents who are in this space of what your fears were? I know you said you had fears about what might come for the future. Do you remember what any of those are? Are you comfortable sharing?
Whether I can think of an exact specific fear, no. But, I think what happens is when you're faced with hearing that your child has something and you have Zippo experience with it, it's hard not to go down the rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, what does this mean? What could this be? What will happen? Will this affect this? Will it affect that? And you know, I mean, we had a lot of stuff that happened in the lead up to finding out the diagnosis, and
Hmm.
so, I without getting too specific, there were just things that had happened that I was just like, "Oh god, what does this mean? And what will this look like?" And so it's that mind rabbit hole that we create for ourselves where we just start running the wheels,
Yep.
and whether the hamster knows where it's going or not, it's going.
Right. So it almost sounds like it was a fear of the unknown, but it was even a different unknown with a diagnosis than the fear of the unknown with a quote unquote typical or neurotypical kid that
Yes.
you'd thought might have been the case up until that point. So I know that you've described it as I put my head down and I just went full bore trying to find all of the resources to help my kiddo. You talked about therapy, community, self care, those types of things. So, what did that look like for you and her in terms of strategies that or guidance for other parents navigating this?
All those things that you just mentioned are things that I wish that I had taken more time for myself. One of the things that happened for me was I put my head down and I just charged ahead because basically we found out when she was a junior in high school. So I
Okay.
had a very short window before she was going to be supposed to go to college, and I needed to make sure that she was ready and capable and felt like she could handle being at college, because the most important thing to me was not having her go and then not having success and having potentially to come home, and I didn't want to see that happen. So, um, what that translated though to was I basically, I mean, we can get into this now or a little bit later, but I basically, because in my situation, I didn't have somebody who was driving the bus of her care. And so
Hmm.
I didn't have someone who was facilitating. Her pediatrician was not taking charge. I didn't have, one of the things that I now know about is a developmental pediatrician. Didn't know what that was.
Oh.
But that's a pediatrician that focuses specifically on things like developmental challenges, issues, whatever you want to call them, and
Hmm.
help support parents through that process of identifying the resources and the therapies that are going to be helpful. So in our case, it was up to me, and it was up to me to try to figure this stuff out. And I got a newsflash: I don't have an MD. So I was like working through this process without having a whole bunch of background and trying to assimilate and understand the information that I was getting and to try to find out what the best resources would be. And then getting her to those appointments.
So in that process, given that you did the nosedive and the deep dive into finding her all of those resources, you didn't necessarily seek out the help for yourself in terms of the therapy, the community, the self-care, the somehow I know one of the points that you made was like believing that like things will like the puzzle pieces will start to come together. You just need to figure out what they even look like and how to find them. And I use puzzle pieces because I know that that's a symbol for autism as well, but it makes sense because there are so many different pieces to the situation. Like, how do you even find them? So looking back at it, what would you, within those realms, what would you have done differently that you guide parents to do now?
So I think one of the most important steps is that you cannot pretend that it's not happening. And if that means that you need to take yourself and go get some therapy, or
Mhm.
you and your spouse need to go get some therapy, because not every marriage or every partnership or ever even co-parents are going to agree on the process and how things are going to work.
Sure.
So finding methods to support that and finding ways to have those conversations is is critical. Um, Finding a community of parents of autistic kids is also really helpful because it puts it takes away all the explanation. I don't have to explain to you what it's like to be that parent because you live that in a different situation in your household, but there's a commonality,
Right.
um, which
And
can
there's an
be tricky,
understanding.
honestly. Yeah, and it can be tricky because many times the Facebook groups and the resources that are available, in my experience, I can't speak for every one of them, but in my experience, many of them are very much focused on, how do I say this gracefully, venting sessions or, kind of whining and being somewhat negative. And I don't believe autism is a negative. I don't believe that this is a terrible thing. And I do believe that, with the resources and with the right therapies and with the right people involved, you can get through this and your child will excel. And it doesn't matter whether they're excelling. Everybody excels at their own pace, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm.
And so that believing and knowing things that that'll start to make sense, that part, that's my internal optimism. I am optimistic to the core. And so
Mm-hmm.
I believe that if there's a way, we can find it. And that's also where the persistence comes in.
Right. And the thought that comes to me is that maybe if it doesn't exist already, we can create it, but we need to learn about how the brain works, or how it presents. Because I mean, autism, it's a spectrum. That's why they call it autism spectrum, right? Is that it presents differently. And there's high functioning, there's is it nonverbal or like lower functioning of some variety, that like, but there's
Yeah.
people of all different capacities and different presentations of capabilities.
Yes. I do wanna share that whole spectrum and high functioning, low functioning, those are labels that I think are really tricky sometimes because
Mhm.
to be labeled high functioning sometimes means that people don't recognize that you have access needs, and
Mhm.
to be labeled low functioning might assume that there's no competence, and so I think that it's important that we always assume competence and we always recognize the access, points that are there. So, I'm mindful about using those terms.
Right. Well, and again, that's one of those things that I think applies even beyond the autism moniker or the autism category, if you will, or diagnosis, that regardless of what our functions are, we all need different things and we all excel in our own ways, in our own times. And that tolerance and grace is really kind of ever necessary, right? It's just that we're looking at it
Mhm.
through this lens today.
Yes.
So let's talk about actually going and trying to find the resources because I
Sure.
know that's an uphill battle. So what does that look like? And then to your point, like the business that you've created about this and supporting families, where do you fit in as one of those resources?
Sure. So imagine for a moment that you need to find a doctor or a therapist of some kind. And so you have this great big pool of resources. And now you have to narrow it down to people that know how to deal with clients that have autism. So you
Mhm.
get this more narrowed funnel. Then you have to find out whether they're taking new patients, what are the waiting times for getting into those appointments,
Mhm.
And so in some cases, the appointment waits that I ran into, for even for the neuropsych evaluation just to get the autism diagnosis, I was told 18 months by one provider, I was
Oh my
told a
gosh.
year by another, and
Okay.
then 6 months by a third, and then finally I found somebody who I did every bit of charm and every bit of cajoling and every bit of being as nice as I could be and getting my point across, and I was able to get an appointment within 3 weeks, which is unheard of.
Right.
And we got her in because I just didn't have time, and so you narrow this pool down, you make the appointment schedule, you get the child into the appointment or the kid into the appointment, and then you have to wonder if the chemistry is gonna work between the child and the provider. Oh, and did I mention that most times the best providers are not in your backyard? In one case with my daughter, we actually had to drive 40 minutes on a Monday morning in the height of traffic
Oh gosh.
to get to the, occupational therapy, and she would go into the appointment, I would sit and wait for her, and then we would get back in the car, and she would log into her class on her phone using her on her computer using her phone as a hotspot, and she would go to class in the ride home in the car, and then I would drop her off. I was working full time. Fortunately, I had a boss that was incredibly flexible and let me flex my time so that I could make it work for her appointments. Um, and the thing is that it's not just with this one appointment. Every single provider, it's a wash, rinse, and repeat. You got to do the whole process over again. And if it doesn't work out with the provider, then you have to go find another provider. So and then of course, then there's the insurance company as well, in dealing with that. So when I set out to create my business, my focus was on I want to make the road to thriving so much easier for other people. I want to show them the tricks that I have figured out. I want to give them the resources, but I also, using my coaching expertise, want to give them support for all the emotional challenges so that they can feel equipped and ready to go and fully supported.
So, if you had, I don't know, I just lost my train of thought because that's what happens when you're neurodiverse. That's what happens when you're neurotypical, right? So, how many, from what you see with families that are navigating this, right? You were talking about this preponderance of like multiple professionals that you have to navigate this with. Do you have a sense of like what the average number of professionals is that might be part of a care team for a kiddo who receives a diagnosis like this?
Honestly, that number can be anywhere from 4 to 8, but the higher numbers are kids that have co-occurring, issues, other illnesses or other diagnoses that they're dealing with. But, it depends. I mean, every kid is different, obviously, and it depends on what kind of support they can get through the schools,
Mhm,
what the support is that they have to get outside of schools. But it's not just 1 or 2, I mean, it's
mhm.
typically at least 3 or 4 and could be a lot more than that.
So then, once we've gone through this rabbit hole, let's actually take, I mean, you discussed the challenges, right? What are your recommendations for families once they're able to get in to get this diagnosis? What are some of the things that you now know, and or maybe just top level recommendations that you offer to families to navigate this to make it easier for them and for the kids?
I think that one of the big it's gonna sound really funny, but it's keeping track of what's going on. So having a notebook or having an online place that you're keeping track of all the appointments, who you've seen, what has worked, what has not. Also tapping into any kind of a referral network that you can through other parents, who are dealing with similar situations. In fact, I have a neighbor who turned out to be a lifeline for me when I was stuck and I needed a resource. And I called her and I said, I don't know where to go next. What do I do? And she's like, I've got just the person. I'll call ahead and I'll let them know that you're calling. And those moments are invaluable. And not everybody has that. But at least if you know, you have to believe, and this sounds kind of funny, but you have to believe that you're going to get there. And so it's just a matter of continuing to knock on doors, so to speak, quote unquote, or making phone calls and being, as I keep saying, persuasively persistent. One of the things that I feel like is super important is this is frustrating. It's exhausting. You can get really angry, frankly, when you're dealing with the different providers. And yet doing that doesn't really get you anywhere because your child is going to be supported by these people. So I found myself, learning how to put a smile on and be as kind as I could be and be as appreciative as I could be, because doing that is going to support getting ahead, because everybody's willing to help you if you're kind. The minute you throw an attitude, you're not getting anywhere.
I remember when I was a kid, my dad always used to say that you attract more flies with honey than with vinegar.
Hmm.
That, if you are nice and patient, you're going to get farther, no matter how frustrated you are on the inside. So I hear you saying, Melissa, number one, self-care for the adults, for the parent, like taking care, not just the communication, like you were saying, which that is a very practical, tactical approach, right? But also you had mentioned like some of the meditation, which I skipped over, but like taking care of yourself. Bottom line,
Hmm.
you cannot continue to advocate through the frustration and the angst and the fury, probably, right? Like, this is your child that you're trying to advocate for. And it's like, why do you not care? Why are you not trying to help me help my child? I imagine, right?
Right. Right. There's
Um,
also, if I can throw this in real quickly, there's also a piece that's important about preparing your child for the appointments, and, kind of trying to practice and to talk about what's going to happen, and to
mhm.
think about what are the sensory overloads that could happen in the appointment, because, many autistic children have sensory issues because their nervous systems are so sensitive. And so if they walk into an appointment setting and there's, a sound of an HVAC going that's really loud, or there's really bright lighting, or there's something else that's going to be triggering, that makes it hard too. So it's trying to be tactical about your approach to the appointments as well.
Yeah. So that's a thought I hadn't had. Is there an aspect that communicating to the providers, going like, hey, I know that this is a sensory trigger for my kiddo. Is that something that I need to prepare them for? Or like to, is that, have you found good responsiveness to that idea?
I have tried to be proactive, and I have also found that in places that I would have expected that the providers would be very attuned, they didn't appear to have read or file and didn't appear to recognize it. And so we got into situations where I would look at my daughter and realize that we had something going on, and she was always very clear that I wasn't supposed to interrupt or interject or do anything, that she wanted to be in charge of the appointment. And yet I would be struggling because I would know that if we don't get whatever that sensory thing is under control, it's going to throw the whole appointment. So yes, as much as possible, reaching out ahead of time and asking questions and finding out if these different triggers might be at play, and then asking for how do we mitigate that.
Okay, so I'm hearing self-care, I'm hearing find resources, find a coach like you, a mentor,
Hmm.
a community
Hmm.
of people who've been there, done that, so to speak, in some variation, and who can provide, I imagine, moral support, but also tactical. What's the next step?
Hmm.
Thinking about what those triggers could be, the sensory triggers. I know, I mean, I don't have a diagnosis, but I have sensory triggers, where I mean, I think all of us do to some extent, but certainly
Hmm.
when you have the extremely sensitive nervous system, it's that much more challenging. Um, you said definitely doing, being as kind as possible in navigating folks. Any
Hmm.
recommendations on the insurance side of things?
Um, really get your plan documents out, and really learn about, if you've got a straight HMO, wonderful. If you've got a combination of an HMO and an out of network, figuring out, what they're going to cover, working with the providers offices to ask what insurances they cover or they work with. We kind of hit a point with our daughter where it didn't matter whether the insurance covered it or not. We were going for the care because that was the more important thing. But that gets incredibly expensive. So
Sure.
as much as possible, advocating for yourself, reading the insurance stuff, calling the insurance company and asking lots of questions, and getting names and dates and times of every call you make written down on your notes, so that you can refer
Mhm.
back to who you spoke to the last time.
Sure. It almost sounds like it's being like a detective where you just have to pull all the data together, and you're the one who has to coordinate the care.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, for folks who are looking for somebody like you who've been there, done that, and are now available to support as my dogs join us, how do people find you?
Sure.
And
The
tell
easiest,
us a
yep.
little more about what you do.
Sure. So I run a 6-month program which covers 6 different modules, and they cover everything from mastering the practicalities, which we've talked about today, family and friends, getting the support that you crave, mastering the keys to success with appointments, setting your child up for having more good days than bad days, keeping your child safe, and then fostering your own stamina, confidence, and resilience. All of it is outlined on my website, which is melissakberger.com. Again, that's Melissa, middle initial K, berger.com. And it's a combination of a group experience, coaching experience, and also individual one-on-one appointments as well. And, it's designed to really be a place where you can let your hair down and say, I had a really bad day yesterday and I need some help. Or, hey, I found this really great resource. Let me share it with you. I also provide a very thorough Amazon shopping list that covers a
Mm.
bunch of different areas, from sleep to eating to hygiene to books to toys, the whole gamut of things that you might be interested in finding. And I'm happy to
Awesome.
talk with anybody at any point. Even if it's just a question, please feel free to reach out.
Awesome. And if you're catching this on the replay, pop a question in. I'll make sure that Melissa gets it when we can come back and have her answer it, in the comments on there as well. So we're going to wrap up this portion of our conversation. Thank you, Melissa, for being with us. I really appreciate it. And we are going to now go over to Parent Tween Village, where we are going to talk about this term that we call meltdowns in the experience of the autism diagnosis. She is very clear that it is very different than a tantrum, cannot be addressed the same way as a tantrum. So we are going to pop over there. If you are not yet part of Parent Tween Village, you can join us simply by going over to parenttweenconnection.com/Parent Tween Village and join us. So Melissa, thank you, and I will see you in Parent Tween Village momentarily.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Have a great day, everybody.